Uh, and so the background and motivation for this project is that throughout this project, I found in researching that there is often this sort of almost clinical treatment of these literary sources, and kind of this almost sterile treatment of these literary sources. And so I wanted to, do something a bit different. I mean, obviously, not every single source, journal, book, what have you, about these sources treated them in this manner, but I found that a majority of them did. So I wanted to examine these sources through a more emotional lens, which is where the motivation for looking at it through kind of grief and rage and trauma comes from. So the methodology and kind of organization of my project is to examine women through kind of three main phases and kind of three main roles in their lives. The first being maidenhood and kind of the initial separation of mother and daughter as a result of being, forced to marry, and often at, a very young age. The second kind of role and um, phase is kind of the marriage itself and the kind of marriage ceremony itself, and looking at that as a sort of allegory for the sacrifice of the maiden and the subsequent reactions of the not just the maiden herself, but also of the maiden's mother as well, and see how those interactions and reactions kind of interplay with each other. And finally, looking at post marriage, what happens after marriage to a woman, after she's married, after she's had children, and, what is there for, a woman to do after that, and kind of the rage and grief and trauma again that come from that. So, in order to examine those three main sources, or those three main phases, I've used the following sources. The first being the Homeric hymn to Demeter, composed roughly around the 8th century BCE or so. And this hymn to Demeter focuses on the goddess Demeter, who is an Olympic goddess, the goddess of harvest, goddess of grain, and who is this Olympic goddess, and the abduction of her daughter Persephone, who is the goddess of spring and later becomes queen of the underworld. And this hymn focuses on the abduction of Demeter and Persephone and the separation of mother and daughter and the lengths that the mother, Demeter, goes to in order to get her daughter back. The next main source that I looked at is Iphigenia at Aulis, which is a play composed in about the 5th century BCE in Athens, written by Euripides. And this play focuses on Clytemnestra and Iphigenia and how they were deceived by Clytemnestra's husband Agamemnon, king of the Greeks and commander of the Greek armies during the Trojan War, and how he deceived them in order to bring them to Aulis to sacrifice Iphigenia, kind of under this guise of marriage, and how they uncover that plot, uncover that uh, deception and their reactions to it, and also their reactions to the sacrifice of Iphigenia, and what these reactions mean, and how these reactions and things kind of interplay with each other, and so on and so forth. And finally, the main source that I looked at is Medea, which is another play written in the 5th century BCE, also by Euripides. And this play focuses on Medea, who is a character that showed up in earlier Greek myth and earlier Greek literature. And this play kind of builds upon that and focuses on her life after her kind of main quest in helping Jason, who was an Argonaut, and focusing on their life in Corinth. And the play focuses on Medea uh, hatching a plot against her husband, who has betrayed her, committed infidelity against her, and part of this plot includes murdering their own children because she's so consumed by rage for her husband that she's willing to go to this seemingly unthinkable route in order to exact revenge. And so I look at kind of the rage and grief and trauma that comes as a result of that. Now, for the sake of time, I can only really focus on one main kind of relationship that I looked at in my project. And so I chose to focus on Demeter and Persephone. And specifically, I chose to focus on a very small, about 10 lines or so section in the hymn that occurs roughly 40 lines in, so very, very early on. And the context for the little piece I'm about to show you occurs directly after Persephone has been abducted by Hades, god of the underworld. And this section that I'm showing you is Demeter's reaction to finding out her daughter has been taken, because she was not with her daughter at that time. And so the selection that I have is that sharp grief seized her heart, and she tore the veil on her ambrosial hair with her own hands. She cast a dark cloak on her shoulders, and she sped like a bird over dry land and sea, searching. No one was willing to tell her the truth, not one of the gods or mortals. No bird omen came to her as truthful messenger. Then for 9 days, divine Dio roamed over the earth, holding two torches ablaze in her hand. In her grief, she did not once taste ambrosia or nectar sweet to drink, nor bathed her skin. Now, I wanted to focus on just a few key points that I have kind of highlighted in black and bolded. So the first two are she tore her veil and she cast a dark cloak on her shoulders. These two things have very clear, very explicit connections to uh, mourning and grieving rituals in ancient Greece. And these were very clear, very physical manifestations of, one being in grief and one being in mourning. And even though Demeter does not quite know the truth yet of what happened to her daughter, she doesn't know, that her daughter was taken or the fate that has befallen her daughter. She is already grieving and already involved in these grieving processes. So again, this shows this deep connection of mother and daughter if she is so quickly kind of falling into these grieving patterns. The next main thing that I want to point out is how she has torches ablaze in her hands and how she's carrying them. These are connected to a marriage rite in ancient Greece, because in ancient Greece, part of the marriage procession would be the maiden being carried from her parental home in her childhood home into the home of her new husband. And the mother's role in that procession would be to carry torches. And so by having this here so close and so kind of interrelated to grieving rituals, I took this as meaning this sort of almost perversion of this ritual and this sort of highlighting how marriage isn't this necessarily wonderful thing for the maiden. It can be this very traumatic, very um, grief filled thing, and not just for the maiden but for her mother as well, who has to watch her daughter essentially be taken from her with no say in the matter. And then finally, the last thing that I wanted to highlight here is how it says she did not once taste ambrosia or nectar sweet to drink. And these ambrosia and nectar are things exclusive to the gods and things that give the gods their immortality, basically, and their power. And so, again, not drinking, not eating does have connection to kind of mourning rituals and funerary rites in ancient Greece. Not quite as common, but still the connection is there. And also, I saw this as being sort of Demeter rejecting her role as goddess in favor of prioritizing her role as mother. She doesn't necessarily care about, godly powers or godly, rights or godly, anything if she can't have her daughter with her. And I took this, as being very much speaking to the grief and trauma that, women, mothers go through when their daughters are married off, because their daughters are taken from them, and that sort of identity, that part of their identity is also kind of taken from them as well. And so we see this, Demeter kind of rejecting her role as goddess as well, um, again and again throughout the hymn. And this is kind of the first uh, inkling or kind of evidence of that. All right. So conclusions. What is kind of the point of doing this research? What conclusions have I drawn? And, how can this help not just, in the term of Greek literature, but also kind of humanities and things like that as a whole? So the first main conclusion that I came to is that grief and trauma are prevalent in these sources, but underneath that, or as a driving force of that, is love, which is why I showed you those two quotes at the beginning, because I think those two quotes really encapsulate this point of that. Grief is prevalent, but so is love. Women's lives in this time period, while horrible, they could still find these facets and these inklings of joy and love. And often this came in the love of a mother to her child. The next main conclusion that I came to is that we need to think of these sources, in Greek literature and kind of the humanities as a whole, less as these kind of specimens to be examined and analyzed, and rather as people. Because even if to us, they're fictional, if we kind of remove ourselves from them and we kind of analyze them instead of humanizing them, then that kind of drives us away from the purpose of these stories. But if we instead kind of think of them as people and think of them as these, real living, breathing things, then we can come to this richer understanding, not just of these sources, but of, this entire time period in which these, stories were told. Um, and the kind of final point that I want to make is that, interpretations, change and they shift over time. What we thought 100 years ago isn't what we think now. And I think, especially now, with all these sort of, different ways and theories of looking at things, like racial theory and gender theory, sexuality, things like that. Like, we have come to so many new and exciting conclusions and interpretations of these sources that, we weren't coming to 30, 40 years ago. And that, we also need to keep in mind that the interpretations that we make are as much a reflection of the past as they are of our present. And that by examining these sources, we can better understand, not just the past, but ourselves as well. So thank you.